Dialogue is one of the most underrated elements of Dr. Stone. When you ask someone why you should read Dr. Stone, you usually get a bunch of different answers, like the art, the science, or the plot. Maybe even a comment about the characters. It won't be something about the pacing, I can tell you that much. Point is, dialogue is rarely one of those big answers, mainly because it's such a subtle tool. The only time we think about it is when it's absolutely horrendous. So in this video, I want to talk about Dr. Stone's underappreciated dialogue, and explain how it makes the story incredibly binge-worthy. Before I get started, make sure to comment with some other examples of dialogue in manga. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week in the next video. This week's comment goes to Easy Overdrive for sharing their thoughts on Shiki. If you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. So to get started, I want to just point out why dialogue is so important in a series like Dr. Stone. See, this is a story that goes out of its way to make sure the science it uses is realistic. Naturally, this comes with a fair bit of scientific explanations. And while it can go over our head every now and then, for the most part it usually sticks with us. Which leads to the comment I see all too often about how someone learned more from Dr. Stone than they did in their science class. And there's a reason for that. If you take just about any public speaking class, they'll tell you that you should speak at a conversational level. If you're trying to engage someone in a conversation, then you need to speak with the same pace and tonality that you would use in a casual conversation. Ironically, my voice probably sounds as monotone as Ben Stein, but let's forget about that for a second. Point is, if you want an audience to be engaged, then you gotta talk with them, not at them. And the same applies to character dialogue. It's the reason we hate lengthy expositions or monologues. After a certain point, it just feels like homework. Which is why Inagaki is very careful to make sure all of the dialogue is conversational. For example, let's take a look at Chapter 2. Senku mentions how they need to start reviving people and begins to bring Taiju up to speed on things. He asks how they were able to wake up, and Taiju comes to the conclusion that the stone must have corroded. Next, Senku tries to explain the role of the bat guano, but when Taiju, like most of us, admits that he has no clue what nitric acid is, Senku skips the details and moves on to a simple demonstration. When nothing happens, Senku makes a comment about how if they only had alcohol, which gives Taiju the idea to make wine from grapes. Notice all of this information without a lecture. Like Taiju, we follow Senku through the steps as the two of them work through the problem together. The result is that we, the readers, are told how to revive people through a natural, organic conversation. Rather than like 3 or 4 pages of Senku lecturing us with details, we get one panel where he explains how nitric acid and ethanol yield nitol. Contrast this with some of the notorious Nen ability explanations from Hunter x Hunter, where you learn how the ability works alright, but you gotta break out your big boy reading glasses to get there. We see that we're being lectured and instinctively want to skim through it or just tune it out. But in Dr. Stone, information is mixed in with natural conversations with the characters, so we absorb the information as we engage with the dialogue. Another way to look at it is like this. You know those scenes where a new character gets introduced and somebody just suddenly says something like, "Well, if it isn't you, the 3rd Division Captain Fire User and oldest brother of the Xavier family." It's scenes like this where you're immediately put off because it's very clearly not how people talk. The dialogue that's used to deliver the information is only there to do just that. It's a means to an end. And while I'm sure there's probably a few instances of this in Dr. Stone, it almost never happens. Again, it's because Inagaki does such a good job of creating natural, organic dialogue. For example, later on in the story, Kohaku takes Senku to the village where he runs into Chrome. At this point, Senku had tested the science level of Kinro and Ginro by seeing how they reacted to bubbles. And of course, it turned out to be a big, fat goose egg. But then Chrome comes and makes sense of things by pointing out that you can easily make them from charcoal. Senku picks up on this, realizing along with readers that Chrome seems to be a step ahead of everyone else. Notice how this comes up naturally as a result of the conversation between the characters. As the sorcery battle continues and Chrome shows us more of the resources and tricks he's picked up, it finally occurs to Senku that Chrome learned how to use all this stuff on his own without any knowledge about science. It's at this point that we learn Chrome grew up collecting things and experimenting on them, incidentally learning scientific principles along the way. And this is something we learn as the product of an organic conversation. Inagaki could have just as easily introduced Chrome and had him be like, "I'm a great sorcerer because I've been collecting rocks ever since I was a kid." But he didn't, because you don't just meet someone and then give them your entire life story. You also don't usually challenge them to a sorcery battle, but the point still stands. The information we learn about Chrome is the result of a conversation between Senku and Chrome, and that conversation is the result of the two characters naturally wanting to feel out how much the other one knows. And the reason this works so well is because, like I said earlier, we as readers want to engage with conversations between the characters. It's half the reason we want to follow a story in the first place. So to deliver information, especially in a medium like manga where narration is almost non-existent, you have to weave that information into the interactions between the characters. Now, at this point I've been going on and on about how natural the dialogue is, how organic it is. But what does that really mean? Well, as I'm sure you can imagine, half the battle of writing great character dialogue is writing great characters. Think about it like this. Why do you decide to listen to a certain podcast? Either A, because of the topic, or B, because of the guests. Hell, if the guests are interesting enough, you'll tune in just to get more of them. And that's because part of the fun of listening to a podcast is listening to a back and forth conversation between interesting people, which is exactly why character dialogue is so important. While you are reading a story to follow the plot, you're also looking for interactions between the characters. So if the characters suck and they have no chemistry, then the story could in theory have a great plot, but you'll want to skim through all the small parts. But if the characters are awesome and feel like they have real chemistry, then you'll find yourself glued to each panel as you read those smaller scenes. Now, aside from any obvious puns about science and chemistry, Dr. Stone does a great job of creating scenes where the characters work off of each other. And while I'm sure there's plenty of examples you can think of, pretty much anything with our boy Senku is guaranteed to be iconic. For example, after their little sorcery battle, we see Senku and Chrome geeking out over Chrome's rock collection. They throw out a bunch of Minecraft words, but what you really pay attention to is how they're suddenly acting like little kids sharing trading cards. Meanwhile, you have Kohaku, who is normally full of energy, just sitting there in complete sobriety, as she watches two boys lose their minds over some rocks. Here, the dialogue that's presented is the natural result of putting two dorks in a room full of minerals and a meathead who has no clue what they're talking about. But later on, in the next chapter, we see things switched up. This time, Senku is scheming his takeover of the village, and Kohaku and Chrome, who both want to save Ruri, suddenly start to question Senku's character. The beauty of this scene is that we have Chrome and Kohaku's pure intentions contrasted with Senku's opportunistic tendencies. And it's scenes like these where we can see how Dr. Stone has great characters and great dialogue. In fact, the two have a direct relationship. The characters are great because they're each unique and act like real people instead of just actors in a story. The dialogue is great because it's exactly the kind of banter you would expect between unique characters that can work off of each other in a bunch of different ways. And while banter makes it sound pretty unimportant, it's precisely this kind of banter between the characters that makes it so easy to read Dr. Stone. Because real people banter. So when it's done right, the characters feel like real people and we find ourselves invested in those characters. You'll be reading more and more of this back and forth between the characters before you realize you've already finished 3 or 4 volumes of the story, which is exactly what happens to me when I read Dr. Stone, even when I'm rereading it. I'll laugh at the random chaos in one scene, and before I can stop, I've already read 20 to 30 chapters. And this is exactly why Dr. Stone is the perfect example of how to do dialogue. Not only does it make it easy to absorb the science and follow the plot, but it also makes the characters feel like real people. As a result, you could read Dr. Stone 1,000,000 times and still want to binge it every single time. And that's it for this discussion. If you enjoyed this discussion, then make sure to like the video. Also make sure to comment with your thoughts down below. And if you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.